Hello, everybody, and welcome to the first episode that we're doing of Parting the Veil live. If you're not familiar with Parting the Veil, the goal of this show is to provide some insight into the design philosophies driving Pantheon, while also providing what I would call definitive information about Pantheon's various game systems and mechanics. To accomplish this, our creative director, Chris Joppa Perkins, will be joining me each month as we look to shed more light on various game systems. So welcome to the first episode, Chris. We've been waiting for this, and I like to use this word, so I'm just going to say it. I'm excited. Actually, excited would be an understatement. So chat, give me a word better than excitement. But so what do you think, Chris?
I think excited is the right word. I absolutely do. And, this is kind of a long time coming for me. The idea of this is something I've kind of had in my head and my heart for a while. So to finally be here doing it, I would say that's definitely the right word to use. Excited for this first episode. And a huge thank you to you, Tony, for just the work you've done to, from the backdrop to just kind of putting the nuts and bolts around the way we're going to be incorporating some of the elements that we'll see here in a little bit. It's made it really fun to see you put all this stuff together technically. Great.
Awesome. Yeah, definitely a team effort. And, not just you and I working on things, but the marketing team and help from David. We'll admit it right now. He stayed alive long enough to help us. So got to get my shots in when he's not here. So Chris, before we get into today's topic, I gave a little bit of a brief explanation on what our goals are with Parting the Veil. Is there anything else that you wanted to add to that, talking to that, definitive piece or that clarity?
Well, I just think that's the key point. The key point is to re-emphasize that the goal of this show is to present definitive information. I think that's what people are really interested in. And I want to use this as a vehicle to define, to clarify, minimize what ifs, minimize could be's, really just focus on the detailed information that we're confident to give. And I think, really the goal there and the focus there is to center on design, to center on systems, and specifically the ones that are lacking that kind of clarity, lacking that kind of definitive detail. So that's our focus. I think the community, the viewership at large is going to be excited to have us dig into that each month.
People are saying we should use the word stoked. We bring stoked back.
That's a good word. That's a good word.
So the other thing I want to do, talk about a little bit here is the success of this show is also going to be high on community. I think when we talked, we wanted to also really include the community in these discussions. So just to give everybody a heads up, you'll see it sort of in action tonight. I think that'll provide a better way to understand it. But we are every month going to collect questions from social media. So whether it's Twitter, Facebook, we actually create a Facebook event, which you can sign up for, you can share out, you can ask questions in our YouTube community channel and all our official forums and Instagram, all those places, Discord, you're able to actually submit questions that'll based on our topic. So these posts are out there to gather the best questions we can from the community, ones we can definitively answer. And we'll take some times, as you see tonight, actually with us talking through these and adding them into our conversation. Obviously, Chris and I want to discuss certain things that people probably aren't aware of. But as we're doing that, we want to tie questions from the community. And so again, you'll see that tonight. We're going to give you a special shout out. We just want to say thank you to everybody. So look for those month after the calendar posts. You'll see some time period to put your questions in there. So getting close to getting started here, Chris. Last words before we jump in.
Well, I think community involvement is going to be key. I do think as we go through the show tonight, it'll be more clear how we plan to incorporate that. And hopefully that will be even more, there'll be even more of a turnout next month with questions and things people want more detail on. So, yeah.
So let's jump into our topic. Today's topic is taming and mounting system. And if anyone watched our older style Parting the Veil, Chris, you teased taming for the first time at the end of our first episode we ever did. And I knew that eventually we'd be talking about it. But so what we're going to be talking about is how specifically this system ties into travel in Terminus. So before we get into the specifics, can you tell me why, first of all, there's been a very big focus on designing gameplay paths for travel, like just that basic travel, why that's such an important piece of Pantheon.
It's huge. I mean, traveling around the game world is something that players will spend an incredible amount of time doing when you think of the course of your entire playtime. And so naturally, it's an area that we want to look at, we want to pay close attention to, and really ask the same question we're asking about everything, which is how can we evolve this experience to make it more enjoyable, to make it more interesting, more fun, while still keeping that overall spirit of the game intact that we're trying to create. So let's review just for a second. To have a good travel system, I believe that travel needs to be meaningful. So what does that mean exactly? So when you say that travel is meaningful, first of all, I believe that it calls for what I've described in the past as that sense of arrival. Meaningful travel is going to lead to a sense of arrival when you discover new locations or when you travel to new places. So the world needs to be large enough. Travel needs to take enough time, and in some cases needs to be challenging enough for the moment of arrival at your destination to feel significant, to feel impactful. So that's part of what makes travel meaningful. But the second piece is equally important, and that is the specific paths we design for players to, over time, open up different ways for them to engage in traveling, particularly in ways that make travel more interesting, more enjoyable, and less tedious. And that's the needle being threaded here when we talk about meaningful travel, and specifically travel in Pantheon. I'm convinced that one of the creeping changes that over the last decade has gutted the heart and soul of the MMORPG is this insistence on instantaneous travel. The fact that MMOs today, they're set up in almost this kind of mobile game like veneer that in many ways the games present themselves as these segmented kind of hub lobby based experiences where all of the content in the game is offered by way of instantaneous access. Most of the content of the game is not found out in the open explorable world. It's found in these interface access points where we're queuing up for different modes, we're queuing up for different activities, and the world at large is not being treated as such. It's not being engaged as a living, breathing place that needs to be explored. So yeah, getting the experience of travel right and its supporting systems and context within the game world right in an MMORPG is paramount. It's literally paramount. But we have to balance the sense of arrival and making it meaningful against needless tedium that acknowledges the fact that over time that sense of arrival will lose its luster. And so that has to be balanced with ways for players to, over time, open up and develop for themselves additional means of traveling that keep it feeling fresh, that keep it feeling like a means of advancement, a means of prestige. And I think you'll start to see after what we talk through tonight, some of the ways that we intend for players to be able to do that, to open up some of those aspects of travel. But it's why you won't see flying mounts in our game. Our travel systems, the mechanics that are related to travel, they will allow for world traversal to open up and become more freeing for the player over time, but never to the extreme that flying mounts allow for.
Okay, so I want to just hit one more time on that statement because as you were talking, the chat was already saying no flying mounts, please no flying mounts. You bring up flying mounts. You've talked about what it's done in other games in the past. So you have said that as long as you're on this team, this was a while ago, I'm sure you remember this, as long as you're on this team, there will be no flying mounts in Pantheon. So you're saying you still stand by this statement, right? We can definitively, for everyone to hear, you're still standing by that, right?
I am. Yeah.
Awesome. So, and I think, you hit on the topic of like the why and we're going to get into climbing, we're going to get into some different traveling aspects, but with flying, what does a climbing system mean? So if we build this whole game on this phenomenal adventuring system, something like flying just takes that away immediately, it feels like. So.
Oh, yeah.
Okay, so before we can get into like taming and the mounts, I wanted to start by talking about something that was discussed recently in some of our streams, and this is looking at our overall speed mechanic. So in other MMORPGs, people are probably pretty familiar with like a spell that gives them speed and then just stays on for however long, and they're able to run fast. But in Pantheon, we're looking at this a little bit differently. So we're doing it with what we're calling our sprint mechanic. So can you talk a little bit about how the sprint mechanic is tied into the whole travel system and how that's going to be the main focus?
Mm-hmm. For sure. So the first thing to note is that we are intentionally moving away from emphasizing the amount of always on speed buffs. That's an intentional design decision. To put it simply, we're designing Pantheon to be too deeply strategic, too deeply tactical to allow for something like an unmitigated constant speed buff and the kind of bypassing of all that tactical challenge it would allow for. But I do want to make a distinction there to say, when I say that and emphasize that point, we have combat in mind most specifically. We want to make sure we take the challenge, the tactical challenge of Pantheon, very seriously. It's kind of an immutable pillar of the game. And so we naturally measure other systems and design decisions against that. Are we against players having an edge that they can earn and develop? Absolutely not. We encourage that. We want to see that. Are we against these something like a fire and forget mechanic that allows for so much of that tactical challenge to be lazily avoided or even exploited? Yeah. So what is our answer? Our answer is sprint. Sprint is our answer to that. With sprint, we're handing players a tactical tool that they can use to face the tactical challenges that we present. Sprint is in the full control of the player. It can be used at will. It can be improved through skilling it up. It can be improved through buffs, increasing your endurance pool overall so that you can sprint longer. We think it's a perfect fit, and it's also a lot of fun because it's a player. It's a sovereign skill that you have as a player to utilize when and as you see fit, and when and where it's needed. And yeah, sprint can be used for longer form travel as well, especially with buffs that increase or decrease the amount of endurance drain, and increase the movement speed benefit of sprint. And then as you've increased your endurance pool itself, it can absolutely become part of your longer distance travel as well. And that being the case, buffs that enhance sprint are going to be very much desired, and see a lot of communal kind of interest in getting those buffs and receiving those from other players. But there's also something that we have in mind that's even better for journeying long distance, and that's where the animal taming system comes into play, which is what we're going to be talking about mostly tonight.
Awesome. So before we get into that deep dive, let's get into our first community question, if you don't mind here. It's just a fun one. So it's up here on the screen. This is from our Discord, from Dr. Fist MD. Great name. He just kind of asks the fun question to get started. So what are your favorite mount types from other games as far as looks or creature types? Like, what do you typically lean towards?
Yeah, I mean, my answer on this is going to be kind of boring because I really like horses. I like horse mounts are what I typically gravitate towards. Though I will say, I'm huge fan of lightly armored horses and horses that are a little more imposing. But I've never really seen horses done very well in MMOs. I've always been a little disappointed in them, mainly because of the lack of weightedness, the lack of inertia, and so it just feels very disconnected. And so I want to play an MMO where riding on a mount feels visceral, where you have more of a sense that you're genuinely moving swiftly through the world. That's an amazing feeling. But I do have a soft spot for more exotic animals. Big cats is always something that I've thought were really cool as something that you can ride. Wolves feel kind of the same way. I think there's something pretty neat there. But thankfully I'm not the only person that's going to be feeding into some of the cool kind of interesting creatures.
Horses only. Don't.
Yeah, that'd be pretty sad. That'd be pretty sad for sure.
It's funny. I was thinking about this one too, and it's weird the difference in the two mounts I came up with. And I'm not going to say the game, but there was a flying disc. It had like fog all around it. It matched my armor really cool, so I liked that. And then I had this very generic one. It was like this little hawk strider. But when you hit spacebar, the thing made the most annoying sound that you'll ever hear. And I would literally sit at the beginning of raids and just hit spacebar for like 15, 20 minutes making this thing.
That's not where I was expecting you to go with that.
Yeah, I don't know.
It was the most awful sound in the world, and I incessantly badgered everyone with it. Yeah.
Yeah, it was just like, constantly. I think I nailed that sound too. All right. So thank you, Dr. Fist. So let's get in. So when we're talking about taming, again, you brought this system up publicly during the old format. Before we get into how taming works, like on a high level, can you tell me exactly what the baseline high level purpose of taming is going to be?
Yeah, essentially the heart of the system is about creating additional ways for players to travel in the world. So the focus of the animal taming is travel. But I guess to kind of try and imbue a little bit of the spirit in how we're designing it and the desire behind it, we want to do it in a way that upholds the player's immersive connection to the game's world. So in Pantheon, with all of the biomes, the different biomes, topologies, climates, and then within those, the different habitats that are home to a variety of these different animals and creatures, to engage in travel by forming a bond with an animal in a real-time open world setting, that's going to be impactful.
Awesome. And more fun, probably, than just buying it from a vendor and clicking on it a little bit.
Yeah. Clicking a little token in your backpack and
your horse appears.
Your weightless, turn on a dime horse prop is there. Yeah.
So for taming, is this going to be an ability or a skill? Furthermore, how will players interact with a tameable creature in order to take control of it? So this is going to be kind of really digging in. And how do we know what creatures can be tamed?
Yeah. Okay. So getting into the nitty gritty here. So animal taming will be an opt-in system, first of all, meaning that players can choose to unlock the system once they reach the requisite level and complete a series of quests. So this is not something that everyone can just naturally do. This is something you have to learn to do through a process in game. But once the level is reached, once those quests are completed, the player will receive the animal taming skill and a corresponding tame animal ability, which needs to be assigned to the action bar to be used. There's a few use conditions related to taming, so I'm going to just go through those in a bullet list real quick. First of all, you're only going to be able to tame animals that can be tamed. And yes, I know that sounds obvious, but it's important to note that because not every animal you find is going to be tameable. Just because you see a wild horse doesn't mean you're going to be able to tame it and ride it. And that's meant to just reflect that animals have different temperaments. Some are more predisposed to being tamed and trained. Others are simply too wild-hearted and they're unwilling, unable. And so there will be hunting involved here. There will be looking for an animal that you are able to tame. Second, the target animal cannot be higher level than you if you're going to be able to tame it. So this has to be an equal level animal, an equal level creature, or lower level than you. Third, another one that may sound a little obvious on the nose, but the player will need to have enough animal taming skill to tame the animal if the animal taming skill is required. So simply by learning the general practice of taming animals through these quests that you will do to unlock the system, that will be enough some of the time to tame common animals that are, your level or lower. But there will be certain rare animals that require specific amounts of animal taming skill in order to tame them. And we'll get into how the skill level affects all of that in just a bit. And then fourth, for taming to be successful, the animal cannot enter combat with you before the taming process begins. So with all of those contexts in mind, let me kind of walk you through this a little bit. So to tame an animal, you are going to need to sneak up on it without it hearing you, without it becoming aware of your presence. This is going to be accomplished through crouch walking or sneaking, essentially. So every player will be able to crouch and walk in that way. And in doing so, you are going to reduce the amount of sound that you make, and therefore you'll be able to kind of move. We're not talking about rogue stealth here. We're talking about just
but rogue stealth is going to help, right?
Rogue stealth will help. That's for sure.
There we go.
For sure. But this kind of crouch walking will allow you to, attempt to get close enough to the animal to be able to try to mount it. Now, I'm not going to get into this right now, but I do just on that note want to make the point that we do plan to have several different forms of mob aggression. Some will be triggered through sight, which is the one we're probably all most familiar with. Some hearing, some smell, and then a few other things that I won't mention here. And of course, there will be certain entities that may have a combination of all these things or some of these things factoring into their aggression response. But the implication there is, if this is perhaps a rare animal type, then you may need to deal with more than one sense to be able to get into position to try and tame this animal. So you may need to mask your sound by sneaking. You may need to also try and mask your smell in some way, for example. But continuing on, if you successfully get in range of the creature without alerting it, you can use the tame animal ability. And once you use that, you are going to climb on top of the animal and must remain mounted while the animal is tamed through the duration of that process. And during that time, there's going to be certain actions that you can take, certain things you may need to respond to in order to stay on top of that animal until that taming process is complete and not get thrown off. In addition to that, your endurance is going to play a really important role because basically your endurance will be being depleted and utilized through the duration of that. And if your endurance pool is not large enough to complete the entire process, then that also will mean you fail to tame the animal. And so there will be some animals that you come across that you just won't have enough endurance to actually finish the process and therefore won't be able to tame it. But once the player has successfully tamed the animal, then they're able to ride it freely as their mount. And that mount will then inherit the same basic movement capabilities as the player does, namely the ability to walk, run, jump, and sprint. So now the question of how do you know if an animal is tameable? Basically, what we want to do here is we want to lean into the consideration mechanic. We really we found a few different ways, even outside of the system, that we're excited to kind of imbue into consideration to really make it more of a substantial skill that players are using more commonly. And it's one of the reasons why we, decided to remove level numbers from the NPC nameplates, because we're wanting to kind of, harmonize all the different things that feed into why considering something is important and something that you want to be doing. So with that in mind, once a player activates the animal taming system, once you unlock that system and are able to do that, it's going to augment your consideration messaging when considering animals in relation to if they're tameable or not. So like I said earlier, the main criteria here for taming a common animal is level. So if I'm equal level to this, or it's lower level than me, and it is tameable, it's a tameable animal, when I consider it, I'll see a message like, this animal appears to be tameable. And that lets me know that, okay, here, I found one. I'm gonna go try to tame this. Now, there will be rare animals if you are lucky enough to discover one. Rare creatures, rare animals. And we'll talk a little bit here in a second about what makes them special. But not only do these animals need to be equal or lower level to you, but these rare types will also require a certain amount of animal taming experience to be able to tame them. So if you are high enough level and you have enough animal taming skill, you will get a hint that through your consideration message that says something like, this animal would be challenging to tame. So it's giving you that little hint that it's tameable, but it's going to be challenging, meaning there's something more than just level of play here. I need to have enough animal taming skill. Now, let's say the animal you're considering is tameable, but it's either higher level than you, or it's a rare type and you don't have enough animal taming skill to actually tame it. In that case, you would see something like this animal is beyond your ability to tame. And then lastly, if it's not tameable at all, so the fact that consider message is beyond your ability to tame, that's telling you it's tameable, but it's either too high level or I don't have enough skill. If it's not tameable, it just won't say anything. So there's no verbiage to parse there. If you consider, a wild horse and it just gives you, the other consideration messaging, but doesn't say anything about it being tameable, then that's not something I can tame.
Excellent.
A little bit of a fire hose there.
Right. So will players be able to improve their skill ability with taming? How do they do that? And is it going to be more of an on-off system? Is there going to be any level restriction to your level in the taming skill in the game?
Yes, so you will be able to raise your animal taming skill and improve that. And that's actually going to be necessary I was just talking about taming rarer animals. You're going to need to have, a high enough animal taming skill to do that. But in addition to that, your animal taming skill and how much skill you have is going to play into the stable system, which we'll talk about in a little bit. We'll come back to that one, but let's roll to the next question for now.
Okay, so the next question is, when we talk about, you sort of talked about this a little bit already, but the incentives for players to improve their taming skills. So going out there and sort of working on it, what are those incentives going to be?
Speed and aid with travel is going to be the main incentive for sure. And kind of the most common incentive and reason for engaging in the system. But beyond that, as you progress deeper in the system, and explore further into the world, you could find some animals with special traits that aid with things like climbing, things like aquatic travel, even things like stealthiness to a degree. So primarily speed, yes, but then some special exceptions that players can find.
Cool. Let's jump into our next community question here quickly, and this is from Anton, who is on our YouTube community. And I think some people have thought this. I think some people have already posted questions about this. He says, I want a mule. He really wants a mule. So he asks, at the moment, will there be any mounts for carrying goods?
So we don't have plans for pack mules or beasts of burden just yet. So I've got to leave that one at that for now.
Sure. So looking at what you've talked about with the levels and the types and the skills, it may sound like a really simple question, but how do we know if a creature is better than another of the same type, like a wolf and another wolf? How do we know?
Yeah, that's great. And this is where the system really starts getting cool and for like really exciting to me. And that's just for me. I like this kind of stuff. It just kind of hits on those gamer notes for me. But this is where we can start talking about stats and the stats that animals have as tamed mounts. And this is why building up and having a higher animal taming skill will be something players are going to desire, because since there are stats related to these animals, being able to tame rare animals, those animals will have higher stats and even some other cool aspects. So first of all, tameable animals are going to have five attributes that kind of make up their performance as mounts. I'll list what those are and give a quick description of what they mean. So number one is speed. Speed is going to modify the base movement speed of the mount and the sprinting speed of the mount. Number two is endurance. Endurance is the higher endurance, the larger the endurance pool the animal will have, meaning that when you're sprinting, they're going to be able to sprint for longer. And then certain other movement-based actions could also involve endurance when we talk about some of those special traits that some of the animals can have.
So can I jump in for a second there?
Please,
so
yeah,
then with these mounts having the larger endurance pools, it's safe to assume that when we're mounted, we'll be using the tamed creatures endurance pool instead of our own player.
That's correct. Yep. The third one is stability. So this is going to modify how likely you are to get knocked off of the animal if you take damage. The fourth is handling. So we talked a little bit before about how we want, our mounts to feel like they have weight. And so handling is going to, play into how well they can maneuver. So the higher a handling stat that an animal has, their acceleration, their deceleration rate is going to be tighter. Their turning ability is going to be tighter, so on. And then
it sounds like those players that go out into the world and start a gambling circuit of horse racing or tamable mount racing could actually have better turning radiuses. No, I'm just kidding. Oh, yeah. It's a little thought out there for people putting money on races. That's awesome.
That is key. That's cool. And then the last one is will. And will determines how long the tamed animal will be willing to let you ride it. Now, there's more I'm going to say about that and kind of fill that out a little bit more here in a second. But those are the 5 stats that these animals have. And when it comes to taming a common animal, it's going to fall into. Let me preface this by saying this is kind of how the stat breakdowns are going to work. When you tame an animal, you're going to have access to an additional window in your inventory or your character sheet that you can view the mount that you have and essentially view what stats it has once you've tamed it. So you'll know kind of what you're working with here and how it measures up and whatnot. But when it comes to taming a common animal, not a rare type, it's going to fall into a category that's going to determine its stat breakdown. So basically, to use an example, a swift category animal is going to be an animal that has speed as its primary stat, endurance as its secondary stat, and stability as its tertiary stat, and handling as its endurance and handling as its secondary stats, and stability as its tertiary stat. So I'm gonna walk through kind of a player example to try and illustrate this. So I'm level 10, or it doesn't matter what level I am. I'm higher level than this animal, but there's a level 10 horse that's tameable, a wild horse. And the first thing to note here again is that the level of the animal matters, not only to determine whether I'm able to tame it or not, but the level also determines how high it can roll in its stats. A level 10 animal is capped, for sake of this conversation, a level 10 animal is capped at, say, a maximum stat roll of 10, and in its primary stat. It would then be capped at a maximum stat roll of 6 in its secondary stats and a maximum roll of 3 in its tertiary stat. So the category of the animal is going to determine how high it can roll in various stats. So back to the example, I find a wild horse, I tame it, I discover it's a swift animal type. That means speed is going to be its primary stat, and I'm going to expect to see somewhere between a 7 and a 10 roll in speed. I'm going to expect to see somewhere between a 3 and a 6 roll in endurance and handling, and I'm going to expect to see something of a 1 to a 3 in its stability. So a perfect roll, but would be a 10 in speed, a 6 in endurance and handling, and a 3 in stability. Not including will, which we're going to get to in just a second. But the higher level the animal is, the larger that pool is that it can roll into. And so if we're talking about a horse that's level 20, then we'd be looking at something more like a potential speed roll, a swift horse, potential speed roll of 14 to 20 points in speed, 7 to 13 points in endurance and handling, and then around 1 to 7 points in stability. And so the perfect roll for this level 20 horse is much higher in these stats. And of course, the higher the speed stat is, then the more it's actually going to improve your movement speed and so on and so forth. So my hope is that breaking that down is going to highlight why taming higher level animals will be desirable. But of course, when you get into higher level animals, you're going to be dealing with, having their hearing is going to be better, or they're going to start developing an additional sense that they're tracking with for whether or not they're going to snuff you out before you can get in position to try and tame them and things like that.
So real quick, what you're saying
Yeah.
is that your good old level 10 horse Lucky, the one you've been, tried and true with, as soon as you can see that level 20 Colt out there, you're like, see you later, Lucky. That's what you're saying.
Well, it's not entirely the end of Lucky's story, because we do plan to have a way through kind of a bond system that once, and we'll get into this a little bit more when we talk about stables, but there will be a way to continue to push something that you've developed a true affinity with further along in its stats. So we'll talk about that here in a bit. But I want to go back here and reference something that I mentioned earlier, which ties into why increasing your animal taming skill is going to be important, because it's going to factor into your ability to tame those rare animals when you discover them. And so, what constitutes a rare animal or rare creature type? These are animals that boast a combination of two categories in their primary stat, or two primary stat categories. And so it's going to take the roles from the main attribute of both of those categories. So, for example, and let's move off of a horse. Let's talk about a bear, a thunderpaw bear.
Great.
I know you love bears.
Yeah.
So a thunderpaw bear, if you find one that's able to be tamed, would likely be a spirited category, meaning its primary stat would be endurance, or it could be a brawny category, meaning its primary stat would be stability. But let's say on rare occasions, you would find a rare thunderpaw bear, which after taming it, you would discover is actually a dauntless category, meaning it's actually taking endurance and stability as primary roles, not just one. And so these rare animals are going to be rare and also very desirable, because you're going to be rolling into two primary stats as opposed to one. So in the case of a spirited bear, then you're looking at something like endurance, in a dauntless category, thunderpaw. You're looking at both endurance and stability rolling in that highest range, and then your handling would be your secondary stat, and speed would be your tertiary stat. So these rare animals are going to be really, really great to come by because of how high they can roll in some of these different stats. Now, the last note that I'll make here, and one of the cool things about this rare animal type is that because they key off of the animal taming skill, not just level alone, you can actually find very high stat animals at lower levels if they're rare. And so, again, we're always looking for ways to make visiting, earlier level zones, if you will, even though we don't really have zones that are just only this level range by any means. But there's something to be said about returning to these areas where lower level NPCs are, because if you happen to find a rare level 10 horse, depending on, and the key here is that depending on how high the animal taming skill requirement is, that is going to determine how good their stat rolls can actually be. So it is possible that you could find a level 10 horse or a level 10 wolf that, even though it's only level 10, but it requires like an animal taming skill of like 150. And it ends up being just absolutely phenomenally statted creature, just because it happened to spawn in that degree of rarity. So it does a lot for just kind of retention and kind of that return game of some of these areas. But before I forget, one last thing. I mentioned there were 5 stats, and will is the 5th one. So I want to talk about that one real quick. Will is the stat that determines how long an animal is going to be willing to let you ride it. Essentially, the duration that the animal will remain content with being your mount. And the thing about will is that it's going to roll independently of these other stats. Essentially, again, for the sake of this discussion, just kind of putting out some really clean numbers here. Will, regardless of what level the animal is or what rarity it is, it's always going to roll somewhere between a 1 and a max. And so you could have a pretty abysmal stat rollout, but max will, for example, meaning you can ride it for a really long time before it before it decides to leave. So just wanted to put that out there as a clarification.
Well, that leads us to our next community question, because we're kind of talking about special creatures here. This one is from Twitter. It's actually Clap Michaels. Says, will there be any teamed creatures that will be exclusive to certain classes?
There's definitely room to give a nod to classes like druids, rangers, shamans, because of the nature affinity overtones that those classes have. But honestly, there's really room to do similar things with just about all of them. So yeah, I mean, some classes, and races for that matter, may enjoy a wider flavor or different type of access to certain animals, in by way of it being maybe easier innately for them to tame certain animal types. Or druid, I think it's very possible that a druid would start off with a higher innate animal taming skill once unlocking that system. So there's a lot we can do to play there. Our focus is the fundamental system right now, but adding in some of those class race oriented flavors is important to us. So good question.
Awesome. I'll jump into another question here from YouTube. This is Jazz and Blues. And they ask, will classes have movement abilities or bonus abilities tied to mounted performance?
Yeah. Well, yes. So I think we've already shown off in, I think two development streams ago, we talked about like the Wind Strider ability for the shaman, for example, that improves your sprinting capabilities by decreasing the amount of endurance that you use while sprinting and increasing your sprint speed. But there's also going to be certain items that can provide small scale movement speed modifiers. So if you think of something like a J-boot equivalent item, there could be something like that, but with a much more constrained overall effect. There's a lot of room in the crafting sphere, especially for bridles, saddles, things like that can augment certain stats of these mounts. And having a small little kind of inventory section for these mounts is something that we plan to do for things like that. So, but I think it's when I think of like the druids and their traits that they can imbue, I can absolutely see a druid harnessing traits from a wolf and then being able to imbue that into a wolf mount, things like that, to create some pretty cool effects and just kind of further expand that desirability of the different utility-based things that other classes can offer.
Just to hit on that a little bit, and I'm kind of going off the cusp here, but if I were to get, let's say I had the Wind Strider buff as a player, then I got on my mount, would my mount need to get that buff, do you think, or would it just transfer from me as a player?
That's something that will work out kind of when we get to that stage of the system. I can really see it working both ways, but it's going to hinge on what we ultimately want to do with it vision-wise for the system. So it may make more sense depending on some of the different ways we want to take these animals that have become, in a sense, kind of your companions. It would make sense in that case for them to be treated more like a pet, where they're able to be buffed in certain ways and things like that. So that's, if I had to say right now, that's the direction I expect us to take, is to treat the animals themselves as something that can receive specific types of buffs for things like that. But we'll nail that down when the time comes.
Perfect. All right, awesome. So thank you again for the questions from the community there. So it's been talked about in chat. I don't know if you've seen the chat. It's been asked many times. So let's get into this. Will these tamed creatures stay with you indefinitely? Or just until you're done using them at the moment? We've actually, in taking community questions as well, we had a lot of community members ask if there would be stables or if they're going to be like instantly summonable, like we've seen in other games. So can you talk to this sort of, I guess the word would be permanence, with our mounts?
Yeah, it's a really important question. I'm excited to dive into this one actually, but before we get into stables and how those work, I want to talk a little bit about the purposeful transience or temporary nature of these these mounts. So let's say for now that you have to be level 20 to unlock the animal taming system, just to give ourselves some level of context. The idea here is that part of your adventuring prep, part of your adventuring mindset, when we go back to talking about the meaningfulness of travel, the distance that you need to cross to get to your destination, especially when it's a large distance, looking for an animal that you can tame and ride for a period of time is there to help you on your way. That's the fundamental kind of approach of the system at its most kind of bare bones fundamental level. Now, depending on where you are in the world, you could find one quickly, or you could end up traveling a good distance on foot before you come across a suitable animal, because remember, not every animal can be tamed. Not every wild horse you come across are you going to be able to tame, much less are you going to be successful even, at times in trying to do so. So it's important to remember that these rideable animals are not always going to be available to you simply by right of where you are and what you're able to find. But if we go back to that level 10 wild horse, for example, you've found it, you've successfully tamed it, and now you're riding this horse and going where you want to go. We talked earlier about how the will stat is what fundamentally determines how long an animal, once it's tamed, will remain with you and willing to be ridden. Eventually the time is going to come when that animal has had enough. They're going to buck you off and return home, essentially. Now, with that kind of transience, why did we go through the trouble of developing this stat system, this very in-depth and interesting stat system for the animals, if they're just going to be gone in a flash? And it's because of stables. It's because with stables, we're creating a way for players to move a particular mount towards becoming a permanent fixture for them. And so I want to break down a little bit about how stables work. When you reach level 20, that's the level we're saying, is kind of the level that you can unlock the system. When you've reached that level, not only are you going to get the animal taming skill and the tame animal ability, but you also have now the ability to unlock a stable slot. Unlocking the slot will not come quickly or easily because it's going to cost a good bit of money to do so, but it's going to also require a certain amount of animal taming skill for you to be able to unlock it. So there is a degree of investment into the system that needs to be done before you can unlock a stable slot to use, which is yet another incentive for players to be looking to improve their animal taming skill. But what's cool about the stable is that once you've unlocked that slot, you will be able to register a tamed animal of your choosing in that slot. And once you've registered that animal, that mount will now become available to you while it remains registered. As it's tethered to that stable system, it's going to remain available to you. So I want to define what permanent means. Number one, you're not going to lose the mount if you get knocked off. So the animals that you've just tamed and are riding, if you take damage and get knocked off, that animal is going to get on out of there. If you leave a stabled mount out, so if you've stabled a mount and you dismount it or you get knocked off, whatever, a stabled mount is not going to run away if you get knocked off or dismount. If you leave a stabled mount alone for too long, it's eventually going to wander back to the stable. So you're not gonna lose it, but you will have to return to the stable to be able to get it back if you leave it unattended for too long. And then players you're not gonna be able to tame another animal while a stabled mount is out. So if you get a stabled mount, your mount out of the stable and you're riding it and you get off, you're not gonna be able to go tame something else while it's out. But the goal again is we want to see this system be functional and utilitarian, but we also want to see it flourish into something that players can find more long-term joy and kind of investment in, and even some of the collection aspects of it, where if it's a stable slot that you can unlock at level 20, it's very likely for us to introduce another stable slot, say at level 30, 40, 50, the ability to unlock a few of these slots so that you can have somewhat of a selection of animals that you've chosen and want to keep. And then once stabled, there's going to be opportunities to cultivate a deeper and deeper bond with that animal, caring for it, some different upkeeps and interactions. And doing so is going to kind of unlock more of that animal's potential, both through things like seeing their stats improve over time, but then other kind of things that that is one thing. I'm gonna leave a few things hidden, a few things non-exposed here. Not gonna part the veil fully open, but that's
okay. Fair.
Yeah.
So let's get into another community question here. This is a long-term member of the community. He actually put this on the forums. So on our official forums, he asked, this is Ranris. I hope I say his name right. I've always said it. Ranris. Okay. See, this is...
Ranris.
Hey,
Ranris?
I could have been way worse. I could have been so much worse with that. You've heard me.
It could. You're right.
Ranarius. So he says, will all mounts need to be tamed, or can you buy or rent one?
It's going to be possible to rent common mounts from certain villages, cities, things like that. Not going to be mounts that you can stable. The stats will be, inferior to something that you would find out in the wild. But additionally, there's what the cooler side of the answer to this question is that even though those will be available, what I'm excited about is, and Black Rose Keep is a perfect example because there's a rumor that there's some really stellar horse breeds that they have there, and it's cool to have this system be part of some of the incentive that players can have, and going to different places, different dungeons, specifically overland dungeons, things like that. That coming out with a mount could be part of what you bring back from there.
Awesome. The next one with another community question here, and I promise I'll get this one right. This is also from the forums. This is Oaknut. See, I can pronounce that. That's easy.
Ranris sounds almost like a new creature type, like a walrus or Ranris.
Maybe that's going to become something. So Oaknut asks from our forums, will you be able to use skills or abilities while mounted?
No combat abilities. Not meant to do combat on your mount. But like I alluded to earlier, aside from the foundational movement actions, walking, running, jumping, sprinting, there will be a chance that you can discover certain creatures that have unique traits to them that would allow them to do more interesting things, again, related to climbing, related to swimming, related to stealthing, maybe even related to some airtime.
Some stealthing improvement mounts. That's exciting. Awesome. Thank you for that.
Airtime is different than flying mounts, by the way. So I just want to clarify that.
Yeah,
there's a big difference between a little bit of airtime and full XYZ axis sovereign movement. Which,
right. Good. That's a good clarification.
Not POG.
Before we get to some more general travel questions that came up, are there any last thoughts that you want to get out there when it comes to taming and mounts today?
I mean, I think we've covered just about everything in a good amount of detail, like to really kind of get the heart and enough of the nuts and bolts of the system out there to be consumed. I mean, to push back from the table again just a bit and look at a larger view, again, the goal of the system is we want the same as we want to just about everything that we do, and that is we want the game to be fun. We want the game to be enjoyable. And therefore, the way we envision players moving around the world, the tools that they have at their disposal to do that should be fun, should be interesting, should be, a way that you can kind of look at investing. And it's just another aspect of how you can open up more of the world to you. What personally excites me about this system is, number one, I'm a bit of a collector at heart. I enjoy collecting things. And so I love the ability to hunt for things and track down really specific things. So just the variety of the different, tameable animals and creature types that we're planning for, and how we're handling their loot, their roles, the roles of their stats. And it's just a great, very deep horizontal aspect of the game that I'm really excited about what that's going to add to the experience. But the other thing I love about it is that the way that it upholds a sense of immersive interactivity with the world that we want so much. And that goes back to what I was saying at the very beginning about what's been lost in a lot of the way systems are incorporated into MMOs, is that they're not tethering you to the reality of the world that you're in. And what I love about this is, and I've got to just, I mean, some people may be expecting this, but for the years that we've been considering, mounts and when this kind of design had coalesced, it was back when I had absolutely been deeply impacted by Breath of the Wild as a game experience. And what I want to call out about that is, as a gamer, the first time that I approached a horse just doing its thing, not through a cutscene, not through some prepackaged experience, but it was just there existing. I came up to it, tamed it, and was able to then journey with it, and eventually be able to make it my own, name it, things like that. Not to mention the fact that the feeling of riding on a mount was great as an experience. But that was all hugely impactful, and it was just part of the soup that similar to when the spark of the perception system happened in Guild Wars 2 inside of Divinity's Reach. Like, it was just this moment of like, there's no reason that this kind of impactful moment can't be incorporated into an MMORPG experience, which is where we would expect there to be so much more depth and so much more immersion and connection to the world than anywhere else, because it's perpetual and living. It's ever evolving, and I'm ever existing in this place with all these other people. And anyway, I'm waxing on here a little bit, but
no, I love it. It's true.
Very excited about it.
When we talk about these living, breathing worlds, one of the things we do in our living, breathing world is that we use the creatures around us. They become part of life in some form or fashion, whether it's labor, love, riding. So it's weird in a lot of MMORPGs, there's all these creatures out there, and the only reason they're there is to kill. That's it. So adding this depth to the world, like you said, does bring that immersion in. So it's great. We had a couple more questions left before we wrap up here. So let's go to general travel. This is from Paul from Facebook. So Paul on Facebook asks, will instant, or what a lot of people refer to as fast travel, for long distances be player only?
Yeah, that's a good question. So we don't have any plan for something like a Nexus, something like a plane of knowledge where you're just clicking on things and being whisked away. We do expect players primarily to utilize the gateway system and the Wandering Stone system for unlocking some of that larger distance travel. There's when we have the affinity stones and kind of the things that we've already been placing into the world with in our pre-alpha tests, where players are able to bind themselves to different locations. That's another form of traveling, in the sense that you've traveled to this area, you've discovered it, and now it's become a place with which you can kind of re-engage after a death or something like that. And as far as like really long distance intercontinental type travel, then we really want to lean into sea travel, sea vessels, and whether that's something that is ferrying players rhythmically through just kind of a scheduled departing of ships that players can ride to different places. But then, of course, we're an open world game. So you want to swim it, you want to sail it, be a way to do it.
Awesome. And I think this is going to be our last question. This is from Gulu Gulu in our Discord. What are the differences between Druid and Wizard teleports?
Honestly, they're pretty much the same. They're just obviously different flavors and identities. Different. There's a couple of differences in how they're accessed and how they're unlocked, but they essentially do the same thing fundamentally. But they just are set up in different places, and so it's not like they're going to the exact same places. The places wizards will be able to have access to, and some of the unique places they'll have access to. There's some areas of the world where you might find a wandering stone and a gateway, in some kind of a large proximity to each other. I mean, not next to each other by any means, but then there will be many places that are exclusive to just a wandering stone or just a gateway system to access.
Awesome. Well, that is it for our questions from the community, I believe. And on top of that, I think that wraps up a lot of the discussion points we wanted to kind of get out there to the world and concept right now. It's not just concept designed, it's concept proved. I mean, what we're talking about today is what our system's going to look like, right, Chris? That's the point of the show. So before
definitive. Yes,
yeah, and I think it's important to note too is we've said this a lot in the past, and in this show we're going to be talking a lot about these systems. These aren't systems we dreamed up yesterday. These aren't feature creep. These are long-term defined goals that maybe we just haven't talked about much or we haven't gone in depth on. So I think it's important we note that, because I think sometimes people always fear feature creep, but we're very cognizant of that. And trust me, that's far from where we want to be with everything we're looking at and all the goals in line right now. So anything else, Chris, before we wrap up?
No, I'm excited about this. This is just really nice to be able to talk just very freely and very specifically about these things. As always, we love hearing chatter and feedback on this stuff as the community and viewership at large starts wrapping their heads around it. And so excited for the chatter there, but just excited about next month already. Can't wait to keep diving into more of these.
Awesome. Well, everybody, as you saw, we appreciate all the comments from the community, everybody who submitted questions that we were able to answer today and dig into. Look for our next one when the calendar goes out in the newsletter. So you'll have an idea of what the next topic will be, and we'll take some questions again from all of our platforms. You guys saw that we did it from YouTube, Facebook, Twitter, Discord, forums. I mean, if we have a social media platform, you can ask your questions and we'll be picking those out for the next one. Chris, thank you so much for everything you do for the team, as well as, everybody who's been working on all the stuff we're talking about. It's not a one-man show. We know that. But thank you for being a part of this tonight and being such an advocate for creating a content like this that we just love to be able to share with the community. So I believe that signs us off for episode number 1. Well done, sir. Thank you.
You as well.
And everybody have a great night, and we'll see you next month.
Thanks all. Onward and upward.